He has certain setbacks. He's deaf. He has an inner harmony and a joy that just makes it a beautiful life.
The publicity machine of old Hollywood was built to control one thing above everything else: the narrative. Studios employed entire departments whose sole function was to keep certain truths away from newspapers, away from fan magazines, and away from the public that was paying to believe in the carefully constructed lives of its favorite stars. But some truths could not be managed. A 9-year-old boy with leukemia, a newborn with Down syndrome placed in institutional care within days of birth, a child sent to a psychiatric facility after shock therapy failed, a daughter who died at 40 after a lifetime the industry pretended did not exist. These are not rumors. These are documented family histories, the private medical realities that sat behind the clean publicity photographs of some of the most famous names in Hollywood history. 12 cases. Every one of them real, and almost none of them in the version of these stories you grew up hearing. If you're new here, this channel covers the real history of old Hollywood, the stories the studio era buried. Subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's start from the beginning. 1. Red Skelton and Georgia Davis. Richard Skelton. Red Skelton and Georgia Davis had 2 children. Their son Richard was born in 1948. The diagnosis came when Richard was 9 years old. Doctors identified leukemia and told the family he might have 1 year to live. The illness changed the household immediately. Skelton's television network told him he could take as much time off as he needed. He returned to work in January 1957 anyway, not because the network required it, but because he believed staying professionally active would help him keep Richard's final year as close to normal as possible. After the diagnosis, the family took Richard on an extended trip so he could see as much of the world as possible. On July 22, 1957, they had a private audience with Pope Pius XII. Richard later said that meeting was the highest point of the entire trip. The family returned to the United States as his condition advanced. Richard Skelton died in Los Angeles on May 10, 1958, 10 days before his 10th birthday. 2. David Tomlinson and Audrey Freeman. Willie Tomlinson. David Tomlinson and Audrey Freeman's third son, Willie, grew up in a Britain where autism was still barely understood as a medical condition. As a child, Willie showed the features of autism at a time when even obtaining a clear diagnosis was difficult. Families in that position were left with almost no guidance. Few specialist schools, few trained teachers, and very little public language for children who did not speak, learn, or respond like others. Tomlinson and Audrey did not retreat from the situation. They became part of the early parent-led fight for autistic children and adults. Together with roughly 20 other families, they helped create Somerset Court, the first residential home in Europe devoted specifically to autistic adults. Tomlinson also used his theater and television connections to raise funds for the movement. Supporters he brought in included Robert Morley, Ian Carmichael, Felicity Kendall, and the Beatles. Willie later lived at Somerset Court, then moved to a nearby offshoot facility. He had his own workshop there and became known among the community as a skilled craftsman in wood. 3. Julie Newmar and J. Holt Smith. John Smith. Julie Newmar's son, John Jules Smith, was born in 1981 when she was 48 years old. He was born with Down syndrome. The birth came after 3 miscarriages, and John became her only child. His medical problems deepened when he was still a toddler. He contracted meningitis, survived the infection, but lost his hearing. After that, communication became a central part of his daily care. John was deaf and non-speaking. Newmar learned sign language so she could reach him. She later said that visual things delighted him, that sight became one of his primary ways of connecting with the world. The household adjusted around his needs. John lived with Newmar, made art, attended art classes, and spent time with her in the garden. In later years, scoliosis also limited how much he could walk. Newmar had 2 longtime assistants who helped with meals, household tasks, John's care, and his art classes. 4. Jacqueline Suzanne and Irving Mansfield. Guy Mansfield. Guy Hildy Mansfield was born on December 6, 1946, the only child of Jacqueline Suzanne and Irving Mansfield. The first signs appeared in early childhood. Guy screamed, struck his head against walls, and lost the few words he had managed to learn. At age 3, Dr. Loretta Bender, a specialist in children's psychiatric disorders, diagnosed him with autism, a condition still only beginning to be formally identified in that period. Bender treated him with shock therapy. When it failed, she advised the Mansfields to place Guy at the Emma Pendleton Bradley Home, a psychiatric institution for children in Rhode Island. The family kept the truth out of the press entirely. Friends were told that Guy was away at school in Arizona because of severe asthma. According to people close to the family, his parents still hoped he might recover and did not want him stigmatized before that possibility closed. As of the year 2000, Guy was still living in institutional care and still receiving regular visits from his family. 5. Ed Asner and Carol Jean Vogelman. Charlie Asner. Ed Asner's youngest son, Charlie, was diagnosed with high-functioning autism when he was approximately 8 or 9 years old. Before the diagnosis, the family had no clear framework for what they were observing. Charlie had poor social skills, struggled significantly to fit in with classmates, and exhibited behaviors that adults around him frequently misread as defiance or absence of empathy. Asner later said that before the diagnosis, he had seen Charlie as high-spirited and a rule-breaker. The identification of autism changed the family's direction entirely. Charlie's autism became part of Asner's public advocacy work. Asner spoke openly about how communication with his son required patience, repetition, and deliberate care, that he had to slow down, make each word count, and confirm each thought was received and understood before moving forward. The work continued into the next generation. Matthew Asner, Ed's older son, later had children on the autism spectrum himself and helped build the Ed Asner Family Center for Neurodivergent People and Their Families. 6. Burt Bacharach and Angie Dickinson. Nikki Bacharach. Nikki Bacharach was born on July 12, 1966, the only child of Burt Bacharach and Angie Dickinson. She arrived 3 months premature and weighed less than 2 pounds, 9 ounces. Nikki spent her first months in hospital care, separated from ordinary human contact, while doctors worked to keep her alive. The effects of that birth followed her throughout her life. Her eyesight was significantly damaged. She developed strabismus, and her poor vision later prevented her from pursuing geology, the subject she had studied at California Lutheran University. She also did not speak until she was 3 years old. The harder problems were behavioral and sensory. Nikki was socially withdrawn, obsessive, and dependent on routine and repetition. She had episodes of intense frustration and rage. Sound could become physically unbearable to her. No one gave the family the correct diagnosis during her childhood. Bacharach later said doctors did not call it Asperger's or autism. They described it in terms of behavior issues. At 14, Nikki was hospitalized for psychiatric treatment. She was not diagnosed with Asperger's until years after the condition entered the American Psychiatric Manual in 1994. Angie Dickinson later said hospitalization had been the worst thing that could have been done to her daughter. Nikki Bacharach died on January 4, 2007, at the age of 40. 7. Richard Burton and Sybil Williams. Jessica Burton. Richard Burton and Sybil Williams had 2 daughters. Kate was born in 1957. Jessica was born 2 years later while the family was living in Celigny, Switzerland, near Lake Geneva. Jessica's life moved almost immediately outside the public Burton story. Her condition was described as severe autism with psychiatric illness. Kate Burton later said Jessica was placed in institutional care when she was 6 years old. The separation became permanent. Kate described her younger sister as severely autistic and confirmed in a 2003 interview that Jessica had been living in an institution in the United States for a very long time, that her care had become a fixed part of the family's ongoing life. There were almost no public details about Jessica's daily life, no career, no interviews, no public appearances, no adult biography of any kind. The one clear family detail was financial. Kate confirmed that Richard Burton had earned enough money to ensure Jessica could receive care for the rest of her life. That was the provision he made for her. We're at the halfway point. If you haven't subscribed yet, this channel covers the full documented history of old Hollywood that studios spent decades managing and burying. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming every week. Now let's continue. 8. Robert Redford and Lola Van Wagenen. Scott and James Redford. Robert Redford and Lola Van Wagenen's first son, Scott Anthony Redford, was born in 1959. He lived 2.5 months. The cause was sudden infant death syndrome, a condition in which an apparently healthy infant dies without warning during sleep. There was no extended illness, no diagnosis to manage, no treatment plan. Scott was buried before his father's film career had fully begun. The family later faced a second major medical crisis, this time in adulthood. James Redford was 25 years old when he was diagnosed with primary sclerosing cholangitis, a rare disease that destroys the bile ducts and can result in liver failure. In 1993, James underwent 2 liver transplants. Decades later, cancer was found in his bile duct while he was waiting for a 3rd transplant. Scott Redford died as an infant in 1959. James Redford died in 2020 at the age of 58. 9. Carol O'Connor and Nancy O'Connor. Hugh O'Connor. Carol O'Connor and Nancy O'Connor adopted Hugh in Rome in 1962 when he was 6 days old. The medical crisis came when Hugh was 16. He was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease, a cancer of the lymphatic system. Treatment included surgery to remove a malignant lump in his neck. His parents later said the radiation left him sick enough that he began using marijuana to manage the nausea. That was the first step into a much longer fight. Hugh moved from marijuana to alcohol, quaaludes, cocaine, amphetamines, and prescription drugs. He went through rehabilitation more than once. The illness that had started with cancer treatment kept transforming into a different kind of medical crisis. On March 28, 1995, Hugh called his father and told him he could not face another rehabilitation program. He died that day at 32. Harry Thomas Persigian was subsequently convicted of possessing and furnishing cocaine to Hugh. In 1997, California passed the Drug Dealer Liability Act, legislation that Carol O'Connor publicly backed throughout its passage. 10. Mia Farrow's family. Moses, Tam, and Thaddeus. Mia Farrow's household included several adopted children whose medical situations began before they entered the family. Moses Farrow was adopted from Korea at the age of 2. He had cerebral palsy, a condition affecting movement and muscle control. He later became a family therapist and photographer, but his childhood required care and adaptation within a household built around significantly different needs. Tam Farrow came from Vietnam and was blind. In New York, she required specialized education, and Farrow worked to construct a school plan around her disability. Tam died in 2000, with heart problems given as the cause. Thaddeus Farrow was adopted from Kolkata, India, in 1994. He was paraplegic and used a wheelchair. He had spent his early years in an orphanage before coming to the United States. 11. Olivia de Havilland and Marcus Goodrich. Benjamin Goodrich. Benjamin Briggs Goodrich was born on September 27, 1949, the only child of Olivia de Havilland and writer Marcus Goodrich. His illness began when he was 19. Doctors diagnosed him with Hodgkin's lymphoma, a cancer of the lymphatic system. Benjamin survived the first fight and continued building an independent life entirely outside Hollywood. He graduated from the University of Texas, worked as a statistical analyst for Lockheed Missiles and Space Company in Sunnyvale, California, and later became an international banking representative for Texas Commerce Bank in Houston. But the cancer story did not conclude with his initial survival. Reports on Benjamin's death connect his final condition to the long-term after effects of Hodgkin's treatment. For patients treated for Hodgkin's lymphoma, late complications can include significant cardiac damage, sometimes manifesting as heart disease years or decades after treatment ends. Benjamin Goodrich died in Paris on September 29, 1991, 2 days after his 42nd birthday. 12. Neil Young and Peggy Young. Ben Young. Ben Young was born in 1978, the first child of Neil Young and Peggy Young. The diagnosis came in infancy. Neil later wrote that when Ben was approximately 6 months old, a doctor informed them their son had cerebral palsy. Ben's condition was severe. He had major physical disabilities and could not speak in the ordinary way. The next problem was education. Ben needed teachers trained to work with children who had severe speech impairments and significant physical disabilities. Neil and Peggy could not find the right school placement for him. In 1986, they helped create the Bridge School in Hillsborough, California. The school was built specifically for children like Ben, children who needed structured support to communicate, learn, and participate in ordinary life despite severe disabilities. Ben later graduated from Half Moon Bay High School in 1998. 1 year after that, he started a chicken farm on the family ranch. 12. Families. 12 cases where the reality of private life was something no studio press department could fully manage. Leukemia, autism, Down syndrome, addiction, infant death, institutional care, and decades of silence maintained around children the industry preferred not to acknowledge existed at all. What you heard today is not a collection of tragedies assembled for effect. It is the documented record of what was happening inside some of the most famous households of the Golden Age, while the publicity machine was running its standard operations. These parents were not defined only by their most famous roles. They were also the people sitting in hospital corridors, building schools from scratch, visiting institutions every Sunday, and passing legislation in memory of sons who should still be alive. That is the full record, and it deserves to be told as clearly as anything else in this era's history. If this channel is giving you the old Hollywood stories that the studio version left out, subscribe, share this video, and leave a comment below. Which of these 15 cases were you unaware of before today? We'll see you in the next one.